The Arizona desert holds many secrets beneath its vast, unforgiving skies. Some are buried in the sand, others hidden in canyon shadows, and a few, the most dangerous kind, are carried in the hearts of those who call this harsh land home. But for Margaret Collins, the desert had always been an open book, a place of refuge rather than mystery. Until that blood-red dawn in September 1877, when destiny came calling in the form of a wounded warrior who would forever alter the course of her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning that would change everything began like any other at Whispering Springs Ranch. Margaret Collins rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime ingrained so deeply that even on Sundays her body refused to acknowledge the concept of rest. At 32, she had long since abandoned any pretense that she might someday adjust to civilized hours. The desert had its own rhythm, and those who survived here learned to move in harmony with it or perished. She stepped onto the porch of the modest ranch house, coffee mug warming her hands against the pre-dawn chill. The first hint of daylight brushed the eastern horizon with pale fingers, and in that liminal space between night and morning, Whispering Springs seemed suspended in perfect stillness. Her gaze swept across the property, the small barn where 2 horses and a stubborn mule named Hector dozed in their stalls, the chicken coop where her laying hens would soon begin their daily complaints, the vegetable garden that thrived against all odds, thanks to the natural spring that gave the ranch its name. It wasn't much compared to the sprawling cattle operations that dominated the territory, but it was hers, every weathered board and rocky acre. 5 years of backbreaking work had transformed what had once been her brother's failed dream into something sustainable. Not profitable, perhaps, but enough to keep her independent in a land where unattached women were expected to either marry or depart. Margaret sipped her coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. At this hour, with no one to witness, she allowed herself a moment of pride. Women weren't supposed to run ranches alone. They certainly weren't supposed to succeed where men had failed. Yet here she stood, proof that determination could sometimes overcome both nature and convention. The sound came so suddenly that at first she thought she'd imagined it, a low moan carried on the dawn breeze, human rather than animal. Margaret set down her mug, instantly alert. Whispering Springs sat in contested territory, technically under U.S. Army protection, but functionally caught in the no-man's land between advancing settlement and Apache lands. Most of her neighbors kept firearms within easy reach and slept lightly, ever vigilant against the threat of raids. Margaret kept a Winchester repeating rifle and a Colt revolver, but they remained racked indoors more often than not. Her relationship with the local Apache had always been different, cautious but not hostile. 3 years earlier, she had found a young Apache boy with a broken leg near her property, rather than alert the cavalry at Fort Graham, 15 miles. Away, she had tended his injuries and returned him to the edge of Apache territory. Since then, her ranch had remained untouched during sporadic raids that hit other homesteads. The moan came again, louder this time, emanating from the direction of the spring that bubbled up from deep underground about 100 yards behind. The house. Margaret hesitated only briefly before stepping back inside to retrieve her revolver. Compassion was one thing. Foolishness was another entirely. The eastern sky had reddened considerably by the time she reached the spring, painting the landscape in otherworldly crimson. The natural pool formed by the spring was surrounded by cottonwoods and mesquite, creating a small oasis of green amid the desert browns. The moaning had stopped, but Margaret's instincts told her she wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "I know someone's there. I'm armed, so show yourself slowly." Silence answered her, broken only by the gentle gurgling of the spring. Margaret moved closer, revolver held ready but not aimed. That's when she saw him. A dark shape slumped against one of the cottonwoods at the water's edge. He was Apache, unmistakably so, from his long black hair to the distinctive leather leggings and moccasins. But what caught Margaret's attention was the blood, so much blood that the ground beneath him had turned to rust-colored mud. A bullet wound in his left shoulder had soaked his upper body, and a deep gash across his thigh added to the crimson mess. Despite his injuries, his hand moved toward a knife at his belt when he registered her presence. The effort seemed to drain what little strength remained, and his arm fell limply to his side. His eyes, however, remained defiant, dark pools of pride and pain that locked onto hers with startling intensity. Margaret had seen that look before, in wounded predators, the dangerous dignity of a creature that expected death but would fight to its last breath. She lowered her revolver slightly, though she kept it ready. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, unsure if he understood English. "You need help." The wounded Apache's gaze flickered to her gun, then back to her face. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp, but his English was clear, if accented. "Then perhaps put away your weapon, woman." The unexpected reply startled her, though she maintained her composure. "Perhaps when I'm certain you won't use that knife." A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face before. Pain reasserted itself. "If I could use knife, would have done so already." His eyes closed briefly as a wave of agony washed over him. "Army patrol, 3 bullets. I took 2. Margaret assessed the situation with the pragmatism that had kept her alive in this unforgiving territory. This was no ordinary Apache warrior. His bearing, even wounded, conveyed authority. The intricate beadwork on his clothing and the silver concho belt at his waist marked him as someone of importance. More concerning was what he represented. If army patrols were actively engaging Apache fighters this close to Whispering Springs, the tentative peace in the region was fracturing. The smart decision would be to walk away, to return to her house, saddle her fastest horse, and ride to Fort Graham to report the encounter. The cavalry would send men. They would either capture or kill the wounded Apache, and Margaret's status as a loyal American citizen would be reinforced. It was the sensible choice, the expected choice. Margaret Collins holstered her revolver. "You've lost too much blood," she said, kneeling beside him. "I need to get you to my house before you die, right here." Surprise registered in his eyes, followed by suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because you need it," she replied simply, examining his wounds with clinical detachment. "The bullet in your shoulder needs to come out. The leg needs cleaning and stitching. Can you walk if I support you?" He studied her face, searching for deceit or ulterior motives. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he gave a single sharp nod. "I can walk." It was more aspiration than fact. When Margaret helped him to his feet, he swayed dangerously, his face going grey beneath its copper tone. But true to his word, he remained standing, one arm draped reluctantly across her shoulders as they began the slow, painful journey to the ranch house. "Do you have a name?" Margaret asked, partly to keep him conscious, and partly because addressing him as wounded Apache seemed insufficient given the circumstances. "I am called Nakohe," he replied, each word measured against the pain of movement. "It means warrior." "Of course it does," Margaret muttered, adjusting her grip as they navigated the uneven ground. "I'm Margaret Collins." "Margaret," he repeated, the syllables careful and precise despite his condition. "You have brave heart, or perhaps foolish one. Most folks around here would vote for foolish," she acknowledged, earning another flicker of that almost smile. By the time they reached the house, Nakohe was barely conscious, his weight increasingly heavy against Margaret's shoulder. Getting him inside and onto the spare bed was a challenge that left her breathless and him grey-faced with pain. The bed linens immediately began soaking up blood from his wounds. Margaret had learned rudimentary medical skills out of necessity. Living alone, 15 miles from the nearest doctor, meant either acquiring the ability to treat injuries or dying from them. She gathered her supplies, clean cloths, her sharpest knife, whiskey for both disinfectant and anesthetic, needle, and thread for stitching. As an afterthought, she added a leather belt, something to bite down on when the pain became unbearable. Nakohe watched her preparations through half-lidded eyes that missed nothing. When she approached with the whiskey bottle, he shook his head. "No spirits. Clouds the mind. It's going to hurt like hell," Margaret warned. "I have to dig that bullet out." His expression didn't change. "Pain is temporary. Weakness lasts." Margaret set the whiskey aside, respecting his choice even as she questioned his wisdom. She offered the belt instead, which he accepted with a curt nod. What followed was a grueling test of endurance for them both. Margaret worked methodically, cleaning away enough blood to properly assess the wounds, then focusing on the bullet lodged in his shoulder. Nakohe remained conscious throughout, his teeth clenched on the leather, his body rigid with the effort of remaining still. Not once did he cry out, though sweat beaded on his forehead and his breathing grew ragged. When the bullet finally came free, a misshapen piece of lead that had thankfully missed bone, Margaret felt a surge of triumph that surprised her with its intensity. The worst was over. The leg wound, though deep, was a clean slash that needed thorough cleaning and careful stitching, but presented no particular challenges. Throughout the ordeal, they spoke little. Words seemed superfluous in the face of such intimate and necessary violence. By the time Margaret tied off the last stitch and began bandaging the wounds, the sun had risen fully, bathing the room in the golden light of mid-morning. "You have done this before," Nakohe observed, his voice hoarse but stronger than she expected. "Not bullet wounds," Margaret admitted, securing the bandage. "But a rancher sees plenty of injuries. Animals, hired hands, myself when I'm being careless." She paused, tying off the final knot. "You should rest now. Your body needs to recover." "And then what, Margaret Collins?" he asked, his dark eyes suddenly sharp, despite his exhaustion. "Will you send for soldiers when I sleep?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. They both knew what his presence meant. Harboring an Apache warrior, particularly one who admitted to exchanging fire with army patrols, could be considered treason. If discovered, she might lose more than just her ranch. Margaret met his gaze directly. "No, I won't send for soldiers." She began cleaning up the bloody cloths and instruments. "But when you're strong enough to travel, you'll need to go. This place won't stay quiet for long, especially if that patrol is looking for you." Nakohe studied her face, searching for deception and finding none. Something shifted in his expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the seed from which trust might eventually grow. "Why?" he asked simply. Margaret considered the question as she worked, surprised to find she didn't have a ready answer. Why indeed? This wasn't like helping an injured child. This man was, by any reasonable definition, an enemy of her people. Yet something in her had recognized something in him. A kindred spirit, perhaps, another soul who understood what it meant to stand alone against a world that expected submission. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally, knowing. The words were true, but incomplete. "And because I've never much cared for being told who deserves help and who doesn't." Nako's eyes were already growing heavy with exhaustion, but his lips curved slightly. "The Apache have word for people like you. Nada, the one who sees beyond." His voice grew fainter as sleep began to claim him. "Dangerous gift, Nada. Changes everything it touches." As his breathing deepened into the rhythm of healing sleep, Margaret stood watching him for a long moment. The Arizona sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. Outside, her chickens clucked impatiently, and somewhere in the distance, A hawk cried its hunting call. Life continued its ordinary patterns, yet Margaret Collins knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing would ever be quite ordinary again. She had crossed some invisible boundary, made a choice that would ripple outward in ways she couldn't possibly predict. For good or ill, her destiny had become entangled with that of the wounded warrior who now slept under her roof. And somewhere, deep in the desert, other Apache were surely looking for their missing chief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm at Whispering Springs Ranch. Margaret tended to Nakohe's wounds twice daily, changing bandages and checking for signs of infection. She managed her regular chores, feeding livestock, tending the garden, repairing fences, all while keeping a watchful eye on the dusty trail that led to her property. Every distant horseman triggered a moment of dread, though thus far they'd been nothing more threatening than a traveling peddler and old Mr. Jenkins from the next ranch over, looking for a stray calf. Nakohe proved to be an unexpectedly cooperative, patient, following Margaret's instructions without complaint. He slept much of the first 2 days, his body demanding rest to heal the damage wrought by bullet and blade. When awake, he watched her with keen intelligence, asking occasional questions about her life at Whispering Springs, offering nothing about himself beyond what she'd already deduced. By the 3rd day, fever struck, the dreaded infection Margaret had feared. Nakohe's skin burned beneath her touch, his breathing became labored, and in the depths of night he spoke in his native language, words she couldn't understand, but whose urgency transcended the barrier of comprehension. Margaret had seen infection. Claim lives before. Out here a simple cut could fester and kill if not properly treated. She worked tirelessly, applying poultices of herbs she'd learned to use from a Mexican woman in Tucson, bathing Nakohe's fevered body with cool water from the spring, forcing willow bark tea between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. On the 4th night, as Nakohe thrashed in the grip of fevered dreams, Margaret sat beside his bed, her own exhaustion a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She had barely slept since finding him at the spring, catching only brief moments of rest between treatments and chores. The rational part of her mind questioned the wisdom of her actions. Why risk everything for this man? This stranger whose people were considered enemies by everyone she knew? "You fight for me," Nakohe murmured suddenly, his eyes opening, though Margaret wasn't certain he actually saw her. Why? The question echoed her own thoughts so precisely that she nearly laughed, despite the gravity of the situation. "I've never been one to start a job and not finish it," she replied, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. His hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. "Truth," he demanded, his gaze briefly clearing. "Give me truth, Margaret." Exhaustion had stripped away her usual guards. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe because you remind me that there's more to this territory than what the army or the newspapers claim. Maybe because I'm tired of watching people die for lines drawn on maps by men who've never set foot on this land." Nakohe's grip relaxed, his thumb moving briefly across the pulse point at her wrist, in what might have been a caress before his hand fell back to the bed. "You speak with straight tongue," he murmured, eyes drifting closed again. "Rare gift among your people." By dawn, the fever had broken. Margaret found Nakohe awake and clear-eyed when she entered the room, his gaze steady as she checked his wounds. The shoulder was healing well, the infection receding. The leg would take longer, but showed no further signs of putrefaction. "You saved my life. Twice now," he said as she finished replacing the bandages. "Apache do not forget such debts." "It's not a debt," Margaret replied, gathering her supplies. "I don't keep ledgers on human lives. Your people do, Nakohe observed, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful for her reaction. They count each Apache killed as victory, each white settler killed as justification for killing more Apache. Margaret couldn't deny the truth in his words. The newspapers from Tucson were filled with accounts that dehumanized the Apache, painting them as savage obstacles to civilization rather than people defending their ancestral lands. "I'm not them," she said simply, "and I suspect you're not what they think you are either." Something shifted in Nakohe's expression, a barely perceptible softening around his eyes. "No, not what they think." He adjusted his position with a slight wince. "I am chief of the Tsokanende band. We fight when necessary, but prefer peace." The confirmation of her suspicion that she had indeed been harboring not just any Apache warrior but a chief sent a chill down Margaret's spine. If the army discovered his presence, they would hang her as a traitor without hesitation. "That explains why a patrol was shooting at you," she said, keeping her voice even despite the implications. "They know who you are." Nakohe nodded. "No, Colonel Adams at Fort Graham has special hatred for me, says I am obstacle to progress." His mouth curved in a sardonic smile. "He is not wrong." Margaret had met Colonel Adams once, at a territorial gathering in Tucson. He had struck her as a rigid man, convinced of his own righteousness and contemptuous of anyone, particularly any woman, who questioned army policies regarding the Apache. "You were negotiating with them," she guessed, "before they shot you." "Yes, they requested meeting, claimed to want treaty talks." Nakohe's expression darkened. "Was trap. No talks, only ambush. I escaped, but 2 of my warriors died." The treachery didn't surprise Margaret as much as it should have. She had lived in the territory long enough to know that promises to the Apache were considered expedient rather than binding by many officials. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. Nakohe studied her face. "Why did you come to this place, Margaret Collins? Woman alone in dangerous land?" The question was unexpected, shifting from politics to personal history with no warning. Margaret hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her story. "My brother Thomas homesteaded this land after the war," she said finally. "He wrote that he'd found paradise, good water, decent soil, beautiful country. He was always enthusiastic." A sad smile touched her lips. Reality didn't match his dreams. The land was harder than he expected. Apache raids had everyone on edge, and he'd never been particularly practical. She moved to the window, looking out at the landscape she'd come to love, despite its harshness. "He died of fever 3 years after arriving. I was his only family, so I came to settle his affairs, intended to sell the place and go back east." She shrugged. "Never left." "Land speaks to some souls," Nakohe observed, "calls them home." "Yes," Margaret agreed, surprised by his understanding. "Though many would say a woman has no business trying to work a ranch alone. Many would be fools," Nakohe replied with simple certainty. "Strength is strength, whether in man or woman." The days that followed brought increasing strength to Nakohe and increasing danger to Whispering Springs. Twice, Margaret spotted army patrols in the distance, methodically searching the territory. She rode out to meet them each time, her face a mask of innocent concern as she inquired whether there was trouble. "Just routine patrol, ma'am," the young lieutenant had assured her the second time, though his eyes had been sharp with suspicion. "Any strangers pass through your property lately?" "Not a soul," Margaret had replied, the lie coming easier than she expected. "Though I did lose a chicken to a coyote 2 nights ago. Does the army handle those these days too?" The lieutenant had flushed at her gentle mockery, but he'd also lingered, asking pointed questions about her living situation, whether she'd seen any Apache signs, if she kept a weapon handy. Margaret had maintained her facade of mild-mannered frontier woman, all the while conscious that Nakohe was hidden in her root cellar less than 100 yards away, armed with her Winchester should things go badly. As Nakohe recovered, their conversations deepened. He told her of Apache ways, their profound connection to the land, their governance by consensus rather than autocracy, their sophisticated understanding of desert plants for both medicine and sustenance. She shared her own knowledge of ranching, her struggles with neighboring settlers who disapproved of her independence, her quiet defiance of expectations. They discovered unexpected common ground in their love of dawn and dusk, the transitional hours when the desert revealed its most spectacular beauty. Both had lost parents young and had been forced to assume responsibilities beyond their years. Both felt the weight of others' expectations alongside a stubborn determination to chart their own course. On the morning of the 7th day, Margaret entered the spare room to find Nakohe standing by the window, testing his injured leg. He wore only his buckskin leggings, his copper torso bare except for the bandage on his shoulder. Morning light sculpted the planes of his body, highlighting the strength that had enabled him to survive wounds that would have killed most men. "You should be resting," she chided, though without much conviction. Nakohe turned, and Margaret was struck by the transformation. The wounded warrior she had dragged from the spring had been replaced by a man of commanding presence, his eyes clear and penetrating, his bearing that of a natural leader. "Time grows short," he said. "My people will be searching. Army patrols come closer each day." Margaret knew he was right. The precarious sanctuary of Whispering Springs couldn't last much longer. Either the Apache would find them, or the army would. Either way, the fragile peace they had constructed would shatter. "You're still healing," she protested, though she knew the argument was futile. "Enough to travel," Nakohe countered. "I leave tonight, under darkness." An unexpected pang of loss caught Margaret by surprise. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to their conversations, to the strange companionship that had developed across the cultural chasm between them. "Will your people be nearby?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Yes. Hidden camp. In Dragon Mountains." He hesitated, then added, "They will have seen smoke from army attack. Will think me dead if I do not return soon." The practical considerations were obvious. He needed to rejoin his people, to resume leadership before the band scattered or chose another chief. The longer he stayed, the greater the danger to them, both. Yet something in Margaret rebelled against the clean, sensible separation. "I can help you reach the mountains," she offered impulsively. "I know trails the army doesn't patrol." Nakohe's eyes narrowed. "Too dangerous for you. If caught, they hang you as traitor." "They'd have to catch me first," Margaret replied with more bravado than she felt. "Besides, you're still weak. If you encounter a patrol alone, you won't stand." A chance. A silent battle of wills ensued, neither willing to concede the point. Finally, Nakohe inclined his head in the barest acknowledgement. "You have warrior's heart, Nadar," he said, using the Apache name he had given her. "But decision cannot be made yet. First, we have visitors." Margaret followed his gaze to the window. In the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of riders. Too many for a casual visit, moving too purposefully for a routine patrol. "How many?" she asked, her mouth suddenly dry. 8, perhaps 10, Nakohe replied, already moving toward his weapons with only the slightest hitch in his stride. "Not army. They ride differently." His face changed as the riders drew closer, recognition dawning. "Apache, my people." Margaret felt a surge of relief followed immediately by apprehension. Apache warriors on her property would confirm every suspicion the army already harbored. But the die was cast. There would be no hiding the truth now. "What will you tell them?" she asked, watching as Nakohe strapped on his knife. His dark eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Truth. That Nadar saved Chief twice over." That debt is owed. He moved toward the door with fluid grace despite his healing wounds. What happens next depends on many voices, not just mine. As they stepped onto the porch to await the approaching riders, Margaret felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. Whatever happened in the coming hours would irrevocably alter her life at Whispering Springs. For better or worse, the solitary existence she had carved out for herself was about to change forever. The Apache warriors approached Whispering Springs in formation, dust billowing behind their horses as they rode with the fluid confidence of men born to the saddle. Margaret stood beside Nakohe on the porch, her hand instinctively near the revolver at her hip, despite knowing it would be useless if the warriors came with hostile intent. 10 against 1 were impossible odds, and Nakohe, though recovering remarkably, was still weakened from his injuries. As they drew closer, Margaret could make out details, feathers adorning some of their hair, rifles and bows carried in readiness, faces painted with the red and black markings of a war party. At their center rode a warrior whose bearing marked him as a leader, his hair streaked with gray, his face a weathered map of experience and authority. "Kitchamasi," Nakohe murmured. "My father's brother, war chief of our band." The recognition seemed to ease some tension in Nakohe's stance. Family, then. But Margaret knew enough of frontier politics to understand that kinship didn't guarantee safety. Leadership among the Apache was complex, based on both heredity and proven ability. A chief who had disappeared for days, presumed dead, might return. To find his position, challenged. The riders halted 30 yards from the house, fanning out in a semicircle that effectively cut off any potential escape. Only the older warrior, Kitchamasi, rode forward, his obsidian eyes moving from Nakohe to Margaret with inscrutable intensity. Nakohe raised his hand in greeting, speaking several sentences in Apache. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, she recognized their cadence as formal, ceremonial. Kitchamasi responded in kind, his voice deep and graveled with age. The exchange continued briefly before switching abruptly to English. A courtesy to Margaret, she realized, or perhaps a strategic choice to ensure she understood what was said. "We thought you dead, sister's son," Kitchamasi said. "3 sons we waited at meeting place. 2 warriors returned to camp with news of ambush. None saw you escape." "I was shot twice," Nakohe replied, gesturing to his bandaged shoulder. "Made it as far as the water spring before strength failed. This woman found me, treated my wounds, protected me from army patrols." Kitchamasi's gaze shifted fully to Margaret, assessing her with the calculating precision of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions based on quick judgments. "Why?" he asked bluntly. It was the same question Nakohe had posed, but from Kitchamasi it carried different weight, suspicion rather than curiosity, threat rather than vulnerability. "Because it was necessary," Margaret answered, meeting his stare directly, "and because I've seen enough death in this territory." Kitchamasi's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his posture. Not relaxation precisely, but a subtle recalibration. "You know who he is?" "A chief of the Tsukanende Apache," Margaret confirmed. "A man the army would very much like to find." "Yet you hid him." "I did." "Knowing the penalty for such action?" "I do." The war chief studied her for another long moment before turning back to Nakohe. They conversed rapidly in Apache, the exchange becoming increasingly animated. Margaret caught Nakohe's repeated use of Nada, the name he had given her, and something that sounded like a protest from Kitchamasi. Finally, Nakohe turned to her. "My uncle says we must leave immediately. Army patrols have been searching every ranch and homestead within 20 miles of ambush site. They will reach this place by tomorrow." "I expected as much," Margaret acknowledged, trying to ignore the hollowness that opened in her chest at the confirmation of his imminent departure. "You should go while there's still daylight to travel." "You misunderstand," Nakohe said. his expression grave. "He says we must leave, both of us." Margaret's confusion must have shown on her face, because Kitchemacy spoke again, his English careful but clear. "Woman who saves chief becomes known to all soldiers. They will come, ask questions, perhaps take you to fort." His weathered face. "Ardent, you know too much about our location, our movements, cannot leave you for them to find." The implication crystallized with chilling clarity. The Apache could not leave her behind, not out of concern for her safety, but as a security measure. She knew too much. "You're taking me prisoner," she stated flatly. Nakohe shook his head. "Not prisoner, under protection." "Is there a difference?" Margaret challenged, anger flaring through her shock. "Either way, I'm being forced from my home against my will." "The difference," Kitchemacy interjected, "is whether you ride or are carried, whether you keep your weapons or lose them, whether you are treated with honor or suspicion." His tone made it clear which option he preferred. Margaret looked to Nakohe, searching his face for any sign that he had anticipated this development. His expression revealed conflict but no surprise. He had known this was a possibility. "I, who cannot override council decision," he said quietly, "but I can promise your safety among our people. No harm will come to you." "Until you decide I'm no longer useful," Margaret replied bitterly. "Then what?" A flash of something like hurt crossed Nakohe's features. "Is that what you believe of me, after days of sharing hearth and home, that I would repay life debt with betrayal?" The genuine injury in his voice gave Margaret pause. She had come to know this man over the past week. His quiet dignity, his intelligence, his honor. Nothing in his character suggested he would sanction harm to someone who had aided him. "No," she admitted finally, "not of you. But I know nothing of your counsel or your uncle's intentions." Kitchemacy made an impatient gesture. "Sun passes while we talk. Decision is made. Pack what you need. One horse only." Margaret recognized the finality in his tone. Whether she agreed or not, she was going with them. Her choices had narrowed to cooperation or resistance, and resistance would only lead to force. She thought of her small ranch, the life she had built here. To abandon it felt like tearing out a piece of herself. Yet the alternative was potentially worse. "I'll need 10 minutes, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "And I want your word that if the situation with the army resolves, I can return to my property." Kitchemacy and Nakohe exchanged glances. After a moment, the older man nodded. "If path becomes safe again, you may return. This I promise, in sight of Creator." It was the most she could hope for under the circumstances. Margaret turned toward the house, then paused. "The animals will be cared for," Nakohe assured her. "2 warriors will remain. Tend your stock. Watch for soldiers. Make it appear you left willingly, not in haste." The thought had clearly already been considered. Margaret wasn't sure whether to be reassured by this evidence of Nakohe's concern for her property or disturbed by how thoroughly the Apache had planned her abduction. For that's what it was, regardless of how they termed it. Inside the house, Margaret moved with efficient precision, her mind racing even as her hands gathered essentials. Clothing, her father's pocket watch, the small daguerreotype of her parents, ammunition for her revolver, herbs for basic medicine, the little money she kept hidden beneath a floorboard. All went into a canvas sack, along with dried beef, hardtack, and a water skin. She hesitated by the fireplace, looking at the rifle mounted above it. The Winchester had been Thomas's pride, and she'd become a decent shot with it over the years. Leaving it behind felt like surrendering a final line of defense, yet bringing it might be seen as a hostile gesture by the Apache. "Take it," Nakohe said from the doorway. He had followed her inside, moving silently despite his injured leg. A woman who saves a chief should not go unarmed among strangers. Margaret reached for the rifle, then hesitated. Will your people see it as a threat? Some will, he acknowledged. Others will see woman worthy of respect. Balance is favorable. She took down the Winchester, checking it was unloaded before, slinging it over her shoulder. Your English improves by the hour, she observed, deflecting her anxiety with the comment. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Had good teacher this past week. Outside, the warriors had dismounted, several inspecting the ranch buildings with professional interest. Kitchumasi remained on his horse, watching as Margaret emerged with her belongings. He gestured to a young warrior who approached leading a paint mare. Strong horse, Kitchumasi said. Good for mountain trails. Margaret recognized it as both. A concession to practicality. Her own horse was a solid ranch animal, but not bred for the rugged terrain of the Dragon Mountains, and a subtle assertion of control. On her own mount, she might have entertained thoughts of escape. On an unfamiliar Apache horse, such attempts would be foolish. She secured her pack and rifle to the saddle, then swung up with the ease of a woman who had spent most of her life on horseback. Nakohe mounted his own horse with only a slight wince, betraying his healing wounds. As they prepared to depart, Margaret took a final look at Whispering Springs, the house with its stone chimney, the barn with its fresh coat of whitewash, the garden where late summer vegetables still ripened on the vine. Everything she had built, everything that anchored her to this corner of the territory. It will be here when you return, Nakohe said quietly, reading her thoughts. If I return, Margaret corrected, unable to keep the edge from her voice. The journey into the mountains was arduous, especially for Nakohe, though he showed no sign of discomfort beyond an occasional tightening around his eyes. They traveled through terrain that seemed designed to break both horses and riders. Steep slopes of loose shale, narrow passes between towering rock formations, dry washes that could turn into deadly torrents with a single cloudburst. Margaret had known the Dragon Mountains from a distance, a jagged silhouette on the horizon, intimidating and unexplored by most settlers. Experiencing them from within was a revelation. Despite the circumstances, she couldn't help but be awed by the stark beauty, spires of red rock thrusting toward the sky, hidden valleys lush with unexpected greenery, ancient pictographs adorning, sheltered cliff faces. They made camp as dusk gathered, in a protected hollow near a small spring. The warriors moved with the coordination of men accustomed to traveling together, establishing a perimeter, caring for horses, preparing a small fire in a stone-lined pit that would minimize visible smoke. Margaret found herself relegated to the edges of activity, neither prisoner nor guest, her status an undefined limbo. She sat apart, watching the efficient preparations, acutely aware of being the only woman among 10 Apache warriors. Occasional glances were cast her way. Some curious, others wary, none overtly hostile, but not particularly welcoming either. Kitchumasi and Nakohe sat in deep conversation on the opposite side of the camp, their voices too low to hear. Whatever they discussed, it involved frequent gestures toward the southern horizon and, occasionally, toward Margaret herself. A young warrior approached, offering a wooden bowl containing what appeared to be a stew of dried meat and wild plants. "Eat," he said, his English limited but clear. "Long ride tomorrow." Margaret accepted the bowl with murmured thanks. The food was unexpectedly flavorful, seasoned with unfamiliar herbs that complemented the smoky taste of the jerked meat. She ate slowly, using the activity to observe the camp and consider her situation. She was, by any reasonable definition, a captive. Yet she had been allowed to keep her weapons, was being fed the same food as the warriors, and had not been bound or mistreated in any way. It was a peculiar form of captivity, one that seemed to exist in a grey area between prisoner and protected guest. As darkness settled fully over the mountains, Nakohe finally approached, lowering himself carefully beside her. "You have questions," he said, making it a statement rather than a query. "Several dozen," Margaret confirmed dryly. "Starting with—" "How long you expect to keep me with your people?" "Until council decides," he replied. "Path ahead has many branches, not all visible yet." "That's not particularly reassuring." Nakohe turned to face her directly, his expression solemn in the firelight. "Truth rarely is, Nadar, but I can promise this: your life gift to me will not be forgotten. Whatever council decides, I stand as your advocate." Margaret studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. Whatever lay ahead in the Apache camp, she believed Nakohe's commitment to her safety was genuine. It was a slender comfort, but in her current circumstances, perhaps the only one available. "Then I suppose we'll see what your council has to say," she said finally, gazing into the dancing flames, "and whether a white woman can find justice among the Apache." They reached the Apache camp shortly after midday on the second day of travel. Unlike the temporary settlements Margaret had imagined, this was a substantial encampment hidden within a sheltered valley high in the Dragon Mountains. Natural rock formations provided protection on 3 sides, while the fourth offered a commanding view of the approaches, making surprise attack virtually impossible. Dozens of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings covered with brush and earth, dotted the valley floor, arranged in small family groupings. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children darted between structures, and women worked at tasks ranging from food preparation to the tanning of hides. It was a complete community, not merely a war party's base. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Children stopped their play to stare. Women paused in their work, and warriors materialized from various points around the perimeter, alert and watchful. All eyes fixed on Margaret, the white woman in their midst, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. An elderly woman emerged from a large central wickiup, her silver hair braided with strips of red cloth, her carriage straight despite her advanced years. Even without introduction, Margaret recognized authority in her bearing. This was someone of significance, a matriarch or medicine woman, perhaps both. "Nijoni," Nakohe greeted her with evident respect. "We return with news for council." The old woman acknowledged him with a slight nod before her gaze settled on Margaret. Her dark eyes, sharp with intelligence and experience, seemed to look beyond physical appearance to something deeper. "So," she said in clear English, "this is the woman who pulled death from our chief's shoulders." Her tone was neutral, offering neither welcome nor rejection. "I am Nijoni, keeper of stories for the Tsokanende, the one they call medicine woman in your tongue." Margaret inclined her head, instinctively matching the older woman's formality. "Margaret Collins of Whispering Springs Ranch." "Not anymore," a warrior muttered in English, just loud enough to be heard, prompting scattered laughter from those nearby. Nijoni silenced them with a sharp glance before returning her attention. "To Margaret. Come down from your horse, Margaret Collins. Council will speak with you when sun touches Western Ridge. Until then, you will stay in my dwelling." She gestured to a young woman nearby. "Tala will show you where to wash away journey dust." It was neither request nor suggestion, but clear instruction. Margaret dismounted, gathering her meager belongings before following the young woman, barely more than a girl, who led her without speaking to a small stream that ran along the eastern edge of the camp. "You may clean here," Tala said, her English heavily accented but understandable. "I bring fresh clothes." She paused, dark eyes studying Margaret with barely concealed curiosity. "Your hair, like fire. May I touch?" The request was so unexpected that Margaret found herself nodding before fully considering it. Tala reached out tentatively, running her fingers through a loose strand of Margaret's auburn hair with something like wonder. "Stories say spirits touched by fire are powerful," the girl said, withdrawing her hand almost reluctantly. "May be true for you, Before Margaret could respond, Tala turned and hurried back toward the camp, leaving her alone by the stream. The cool water was a blessing after 2 days of hard riding, and Margaret took advantage of the momentary privacy to wash thoroughly. Though she remained alert to her surroundings, she might not be bound or guarded, but she harbored no illusions about her ability to leave undetected. Tala returned with a bundle of clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with simple beadwork, soft moccasins, and a woven belt. Nijoni says, "White woman clothes not good for mountains," she explained. "Too many pieces." Margaret considered objecting. Changing into Apache clothing felt symbolically significant, another step away from her own world, but practicality won out. Her riding skirt and blouse were filthy from travel, and the offered garments would indeed be more practical for life in the encampment. When she emerged from behind the screening brush where she had changed, Tala's expression brightened with approval. "Good," she declared. "Now you look less like enemy." "Is that what I am?" Margaret asked quietly. "An enemy?" The girl's dark eyes grew serious. "I not know yet. Council decides." She gestured for Margaret to follow her back to the camp. "Some say enemy, some say friend. Nakoe says life-bringer, life-bringer." The term settled uncomfortably in Margaret's chest. Such labels carried weight in cultures where names held power and meaning. Being designated as the one who had restored their chief to life placed her in a category beyond simple prisoner, for better or worse. Nijoni's dwelling was larger than most in the camp, its interior surprisingly spacious and orderly. Woven mats covered the packed earth floor, and various pouches, bundles of herbs, and carved wooden containers hung from the support poles. In one corner lay a collection of oddities that caught Margaret's attention: several books with worn leather, bindings, a tarnished silver hand mirror, a porcelain doll missing one arm, and other items clearly of white origin. The medicine woman noticed her interest. "Things of your people," she said, entering behind them. "Some traded, some found, some taken. All teach Nijoni about white ways." "You speak English very well," Margaret observed. "Spent 2 seasons at mission school when young," Nijoni replied, arranging herself cross-legged on a mat and indicating Margaret should do the same. "Learned letters, words, white god stories, useful knowledge for dangerous times." The old woman dismissed Tala with a gentle word, then fixed Margaret with a penetrating stare. "Now, tell Nijoni true story of how you found our chief." The request seemed straightforward, but Margaret sensed layers of meaning beneath it. This was no mere curiosity. It was an assessment, perhaps even a test. She recounted the events as they had happened, from hearing the moan near her spring to the arrival of Kitchimasi and his warriors 7 days later. She neither embellished her role nor minimized the danger she had faced in harboring a wounded Apache chief. Nijoni listened without interruption, her weathered face impossible to read. When Margaret finished, the old woman remained silent for several moments, as if weighing each word against some internal measure. "You tell straight story," she said finally. "No boasting, no fear words." She reached for a small pouch at her waist, extracting what appeared to be dried leaves, which she crumbled into a stone bowl. "Council will ask same story. Some will believe, some will not. Some will see only white skin, not actions beneath." "And what do you see?" Margaret asked, emboldened by the woman's directness. Nijoni's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of the forthright question. "I see woman who acts from heart center, not fear place. Dangerous way to live among whites or Apache." She struck a spark into the bowl, causing the leaves to smolder and release. A pungent herbal smoke, but spirits often favor the dangerous ones. Before Margaret could respond, the entrance flap was pushed aside, and Nakohe ducked into the dwelling. He had changed from his travel-worn clothing into garments befitting his rank. a finely tanned buckskin shirt adorned with porcupine quill work, leggings with intricate beadwork along the seams, and a silver concho belt that caught the filtered light. His long black hair, now washed and neatly braided, emphasized the copper planes of his face and the intensity of his dark eyes. For a startling moment, Margaret saw him not as the wounded man she had tended, but as he truly was, a powerful leader in his prime, commanding respect through presence alone. The transformation was so complete that she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. "Council gathers," he said, acknowledging Njoni with a respectful nod before turning to Margaret. "They will hear your story, then decide your place among Tsokanende." "And if I don't like their decision?" Margaret asked, rising to her feet. Something flashed in Nakohe's eyes, concern, perhaps, or regret. "Then we face that pathway when it opens before us." He gestured toward the entrance. "For now, Council waits." The council fire burned in the center of a circular clearing at the heart of the camp. Around it sat 12 Apache, 8 men and 4 women, arranged according to some hierarchy Margaret couldn't discern. Kitchemesi occupied a prominent position, his face impassive as they approached. Njoni took her place among the council members, while Nakohe guided Margaret to stand before them. Behind the seated council, it seemed the entire camp had gathered to witness the proceedings. Warriors with arms folded across their chests, women with children clutching their skirts, elders leaning on walking sticks. The weight of so many eyes made Margaret acutely conscious of her alienness among them, her pale skin and red hair marking her as irrevocably other, despite the Apache clothing she now wore. An elderly man whose face was deeply seamed with age spoke first, his words in Apache translated by Nakohe for Margaret's benefit. "White woman stands before council of Tsokanende. She is not of our blood, not of our ways, yet she walks among us. Council must decide if she walks as friend or enemy, as guest or prisoner." The old man's rheumy eyes fixed on Margaret. "Speak your story so all may hear. Tell how you came to aid our chief when his blood flowed onto your land." Margaret repeated her account, conscious that far more than curiosity motivated her audience. These people were determining her fate based not just on what she said, but how she said it. She kept her voice steady, her gaze direct, her story unembellished, yet complete. When she finished, a murmur ran through the assembled Apache. One of the council women spoke rapidly, gesturing toward Margaret with evident skepticism. Others joined in, the discussion becoming animated. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, the tone was clear. Disagreement, debate, competing perspectives on what should be done with the white woman who had saved their chief. Finally, Kitchemesi raised his hand, silencing the others. "Council has questions," he said in English, perhaps as a courtesy to Margaret, perhaps to ensure her answers weren't filtered through translation. "Why did you not alert soldiers when you found wounded Apache? Woman alone on frontier has reason to fear us, yet you chose to help." It was the fundamental question, the one that cut to the heart of everything that had followed. Margaret considered her response carefully, knowing that a misstep now could prove disastrous. "I've lived in this territory for 5 years," she said, meeting Kitchemesi's penetrating gaze. "In that time, I've seen cruelty and kindness from both whites and Apache. I've buried neighbors killed in raids and heard stories of Apache children shot for sport by drunken soldiers." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I decided long ago to judge people by their actions, not the color of their skin or the language they speak. Your nephew needed help. Nothing else mattered in that moment." Her answer prompted another round of discussion among the council. One warrior spoke forcefully, repeatedly pointing in the direction of the distant fort. An older woman responded with equal passion, gesturing toward Nakohe's healing wounds. As the debate continued, Margaret became aware of Nakohe watching her, his expression unreadable, yet somehow reassuring. Whatever happened next, she believed he would honor his promise to advocate for her safety. The council's deliberations stretched as the afternoon light waned. Finally, as the sun touched the western ridge just as Nijoni had predicted, Kitchemasi stood, signaling a decision had been reached. The camp fell silent, every face turned toward the war chief as he approached Margaret. "Council of Tsokanende has spoken," he announced, his voice carrying to the farthest reaches of the assembled crowd. "The white woman Margaret Collins has shown unusual courage in saving our chief. For this, she deserves honor." A ripple of approval ran through some of the onlookers, while others remained stone-faced. "But," Kitchemasi continued, "she knows our hidden place, our strength, our ways. This knowledge makes her dangerous to all Tsokanende if she returns to White World." His dark eyes fixed on Margaret with unwavering intensity. "Therefore, Council declares she must remain with Apache people as wife to our chief." The pronouncement hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at Kitchemasi, certain she had misunderstood. Marriage to Nakohe. It was so far beyond anything she had anticipated that for several seconds she couldn't form a coherent thought. "This is your council's idea of honor?" she finally managed, anger overriding shock. "Forcing a marriage neither of us has asked for?" "Not force," Kitchemasi corrected, unmoved by her outburst. "Protection. As chief's wife, no warrior may harm you. Your place among us becomes fixed, permanent." His expression hardened slightly. "Alternative is less comfortable." The implicit threat was clear. Become Nakohe's wife or face whatever. Less comfortable arrangement the council deemed appropriate for a woman who knew too much about their hidden stronghold. Margaret turned to Nakohe, searching his face for some sign that he was as blindsided by this decision as she was. His expression revealed conflict but not surprise. He had known this was a possibility, perhaps even expected it. "You knew," she accused quietly. "You knew this was what they would decide." "I suspected," he admitted, his voice equally low. "Marriage between us solves many problems at once. Your safety is guaranteed. Council's concerns about your knowledge are addressed, and—" He hesitated. "Life debt is honored in highest way possible. By forcing me to become your wife?" Margaret hissed, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching their exchange. "How is that honoring anything?" Nakohe's gaze remained steady. "Among Apache, marriage to chief is highest honor for any woman. Council believes they offer great gift." Margaret fought to control her rising fury. The cultural chasm between them had never seemed wider than in this moment. What appeared to the Apache as an honorable solution felt to her like the ultimate loss of autonomy. Her future decided by strangers, according to rules not her own. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Then Council will find different solution," Nakohe replied carefully. "One that ensures you cannot bring danger to our people." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable, permanent captivity or worse. The choice before her was no choice at all, marriage to Nakohe or a fate potentially far more grim. As the reality of her situation crystallized, Margaret felt the weight of hundreds of Apache eyes upon her, waiting for her response. A response that would irrevocably alter the course of her life, one way or another. Silence hung over the council circle as hundreds of eyes remained fixed on Margaret, awaiting her answer to an impossible choice. The weight of expectation pressed against her like a physical force, threatening to crush the breath from her lungs. Marriage to Nakohe or a fate potentially worse, neither option represented the freedom she had fought so hard to maintain. At Whispering Springs, Margaret straightened her spine, drawing on the stubborn resilience that had sustained her through years of frontier solitude. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the hushed gathering. I understand the council's concern for the safety of your people, she began carefully, but where I come from, marriage is a sacred bond entered willingly by both parties, not a political solution imposed by others. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as Kitchomasi's brow furrowed. Before he could respond, Margaret continued, addressing her words directly to him. I ask the council for time, 3 days to consider this decision. In return, I give my word, I will not attempt to escape during that period. It was a desperate gambit, a plea for breathing space to consider alternatives or perhaps negotiate better terms. Kitchomasi's expression remained impassive as he translated her request for the council members who didn't speak English. A heated discussion ensued, with sharp exchanges between several warriors and the more moderate voices of the older women. Finally, Nijoni spoke, her weathered voice carrying authority that silenced the others. After she finished, Kitchomasi turned back to Margaret. Council grants 1 day from this sunset to next. You will remain in Nijoni's lodge under her watch. His eyes narrowed slightly. But know this, decision will not change. Only your acceptance or rejection of Council's wisdom remains to be determined. It wasn't much, but it was something, a brief reprieve before the ultimate choice must be made. Margaret inclined her head in acknowledgement, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the turmoil within. As the council dispersed and the gathered onlookers began to drift away, Nakohe approached her. His face betrayed conflicting emotions, concern, frustration, and something else she couldn't quite identify. You should have accepted, he said quietly. Delay only makes path more difficult. For whom? Margaret challenged. For your council, who would have this settled neatly, or for me, expected to surrender my future on a moment's notice? Nakohe glanced around, aware of the many observers still watching them with undisguised interest. Not here, he murmured. Too many ears, too. Many eyes. He led her to the edge of the camp, where a large flat boulder overlooked the valley below. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, a beauty that seemed obscenely inappropriate given Margaret's circumstances. They sat, side by side, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. You think council forces this marriage as punishment, Nakohe said after a lengthy silence. It is not so. Then explain it to me, Margaret replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Because from where I stand, I've been given the choice between unwanted marriage or unnamed consequences. Nakohe gazed out across the valley, gathering his thoughts. Apache ways different from white ways. Marriage binds families, strengthens bands, creates alliances. He turned to face her directly. When council names you as my wife, they offer highest protection possible. No one may harm Chief's wife without facing blood vengeance from entire band. Protection I wouldn't need if I were allowed to return to my own home, Margaret pointed out. Army searches for you now, Nakohe countered. 2 warriors watching your ranch sent smoke signal yesterday. Soldiers came, searched buildings, took some things. Left man there to wait for your return. His expression darkened. Return now means prison for you, maybe hanging. The news struck Margaret with unexpected force. In focusing on her immediate predicament among the Apache, she had somehow overlooked the obvious, that her actions would indeed be viewed as treasonous by military authorities. By helping Nakohe, she had effectively burned the bridge to her former life. So I trade one prison for another, she said bitterly. Nakohe's eyes flashed. Is that how you see life among my people? As prison? How else should I see it when I'm given no real choice in the matter? Margaret demanded. Your council speaks of honor while stripping me of any say in my own fate. And what fate did you imagine when you pulled dying chief from Spring? Nakohe challenged. Did you think such action would carry no consequence? I thought I was saving a life, Margaret shot back. I didn't realize it would cost me my own in return. As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Nakohe recoiled as if struck, the hurt in his eyes impossible to miss. "If life among Apache seems death to you," he said quietly, "then perhaps Council's wisdom is flawed after all." He rose to leave, but Margaret caught his wrist, suddenly remorseful. "Wait! That's not what I meant!" Nakohe remained standing, but didn't pull away. "What did you mean, then?" Margaret struggled to articulate the complex emotions churning within her. "I meant that I value my freedom to choose my own path. That being told I must marry anyone, even someone She faltered, then continued, "Even someone I've come to respect, feels like losing the independence I've fought so hard to maintain." Something shifted in Nakohe's expression. He sat down, again closer this time, his voice dropping to ensure only she could hear his next words. "What if different choice existed? One council has not considered." Hope flared briefly in Margaret's chest. "What kind of choice?" Nakohe glanced back toward the camp to ensure they weren't being observed too closely. "There is place at edge of Apache territory, trading post run by man called Hostine, half Navajo, half French, friend to many tribes, respected by whites also." His dark eyes met hers with intensity. "If you reached his post, he could arrange passage north to Colorado. Territory, new start beyond reach of Army or Apache Council. The possibility of escape hung between them, tantalizing yet fraught with danger. "Why would you tell me this?" Margaret asked, searching his face. "Why help me leave when your council wants me to stay?" "Because forcing unwilling woman to marriage dishonors both her and man she marries," Nakohe replied simply. "I would not begin life bond with such stain." The admission touched something deep within Margaret. Despite the impossible situation they found themselves in, Nakohe's sense of honor remained intact, enough that he would risk Council's disapproval to offer her an alternative. "The journey would be dangerous," he continued. 3 days hard, riding through territory patrolled by both army and rival bands. You would need guide." His gaze dropped briefly. "I cannot be that guide. My absence would be noticed immediately, and duty to my people comes before all else." "Who, then?" Margaret asked, the brief flare of hope beginning to dim. "Tarek, young warrior who brought you food last night. He is my sister's son, loyal to me above council. If I ask, he will lead you to Hostine's post." Margaret considered the proposal carefully. Escape with a young warrior she didn't know, through territory crawling with army patrols, and possibly hostile Apache from other bands. If caught by the army, she'd face charges of treason. If caught by Kitchemesi's men, she'd face whatever less. Comfortable arrangement had been implied as the alternative to marriage, yet the prospect of freedom, of regaining control over her own destiny, pulled at her with undeniable force. "Why would you risk defying your council for me?" she asked finally. "After they've made their decision clear." Nakohe was silent for a long moment, his profile strong against the darkening sky. When he spoke, his voice carried a note she hadn't heard before, something that might have been regret or perhaps something deeper. "When you found me at Spring, you did not see enemy. You saw man needing help." He turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the last rays of sunset. "I would show same sight now, see woman needing freedom, not potential wife needing control." The simple honesty of his statement struck Margaret more powerfully than any elaborate justification could have. In that moment, she glimpsed the true measure of the man before her, not just the Apache chief, but the human being beneath the title. "If I were to stay," she said carefully, the words feeling their way toward a truth she was only beginning to recognize. "It would need to be my choice, not Council's demand." Nakohe's expression remained solemn, but something kindled in his eyes, a cautious hope perhaps. "Council does not see such distinction. To them, marriage solves problem, creates alliance, honors life debt. Simpler than understanding white woman's need for choice." But you understand it, Margaret observed. I have seen enough of White World to know forcing is not same as choosing, he acknowledged. 7 days in your home taught me this, if nothing else. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and indigo. In the camp below, cooking fires winked into existence, and the sounds of evening activities drifted up to their rocky perch. Soon Nijoni would expect Margaret to return to her lodge for the night of contemplation she had been granted. I need to think, Margaret said finally, about both paths, staying or going. Nakohe nodded, rising to his feet with fluid grace, despite his healing wounds. If you choose to leave, come to east edge of camp before dawn. Tarek will be waiting with horses. He hesitated, then added softly, if you choose to stay, come to Council Circle at mid-morning. I will be there. As they walked back toward the camp, in the gathering darkness, Margaret felt the weight of the decision before her. Each option carried profound risks and consequences. Freedom with uncertain survival, or security with constrained choice. Neither path offered easy resolution to her dilemma. Nijoni was waiting at the entrance to her lodge, her weathered face impossible to read in the flickering firelight. Council gives night for thinking, she said as Margaret approached. Use it well. Many paths open before dawn, but sun rises on only one. Inside the lodge, the medicine woman busied herself with various preparations, grinding herbs, sorting, small bones and stones for some purpose Margaret couldn't fathom, occasionally adding twigs to the small central fire. She didn't speak further, seeming to understand Margaret's need for quiet contemplation. Left to her thoughts, Margaret spread her sleeping mat near the fire and sat cross-legged upon it, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. The decision before her would irrevocably shape whatever future remained to her. Freedom with terrible risk, or security with the sacrifice of autonomy, each option exacted its own steep price. As the night deepened around the Apache camp, Margaret Collins stared into the dancing flames, searching for clarity in their hypnotic movement. Somewhere between flickering light and encroaching shadow, the path ahead waited to be chosen. A choice that must be made before the first light of dawn revealed the consequences of either decision. Sleep eluded Margaret throughout the long night. Each time exhaustion threatened to claim her, the weight of her impending decision would jolt her back to wakefulness. Freedom or security, risk or safety, east edge of camp before dawn, or council circle at mid-morning. 2 paths, each irrevocable. Once chosen, Nijoni seemed to slumber peacefully across the lodge, though Margaret suspected the old woman remained attuned to her guest's restless movements. Several times she caught what appeared to be the gleam of open eyes, watching her in the dying firelight, only to find the medicine woman's weathered face composed in apparent sleep moments later. As the deepest part of night settled over the camp, Margaret found herself mentally retracing the bizarre journey that had led her to this moment. 2 weeks ago, her greatest concern had been whether her vegetable garden would survive an early frost. Now, she contemplated either a desperate escape through hostile territory or marriage to an Apache chief whose people were technically at war with her own. The absurdity of it might have made her laugh, had the stakes not been so devastatingly high. An hour before dawn, Margaret made her decision. She gathered her few belongings silently, careful not to wake Nijoni, or at least to maintain the pretense that the old woman slept. Her revolver went into the pocket of the deerskin dress she still wore, the small bundle of personal items tucked securely at her waist. She left behind the clothes she had arrived in. They would only mark her, more obviously as white if she encountered patrols. At the entrance to the lodge, she paused, looking back at the medicine woman's still form. "Thank you for your hospitality," she whispered. uncertain whether her words would be heard or understood. Then she slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The camp was quiet but not silent. A dog barked somewhere near the perimeter, quickly hushed by its owner. Two warriors stood guard at strategic points, their attention focused outward rather than on the lone woman moving purposefully through the shadows. Most of the wiki-ups showed no signs of activity, though a few had smoke beginning to curl from their tops as early risers kindled morning fires. Margaret oriented herself toward the eastern edge of the encampment, where Nakohe had said Tarek would be waiting with horses. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat seeming to echo in the stillness. Discovery now would mean not only the end of her escape attempt, but likely harsher treatment from a council that would see her actions as confirmation of untrustworthiness. She had nearly reached the designated meeting point when a figure materialized from the shadows, blocking her path. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her hidden revolver, but stopped as recognition dawned. Nakohe stood before her, looking unsurprised at her pre-dawn activities. He wore a fringed buckskin shirt and carried a rifle slung across his back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You've chosen," he said simply. Margaret nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I have to try for freedom. Surely you understand that." "I understand choice," Nakohe replied, his voice low to avoid attracting attention. "Not sure I understand timing." The cryptic response made Margaret pause. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Nakohe gestured for her to follow him a short distance away from the path to where a large boulder provided cover from casual observation. Once there, he pointed toward the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightning presaged the coming dawn. Army patrol crossed into Lower Valley last night, he said without preamble. 12 soldiers, scout from rival band guiding them, moving toward this place. The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. "How did they find your camp?" "Not certain they have," Nakohe admitted, "but they search in narrowing circle. Scout is Mescalero, who knows these mountains well." His dark eyes met hers. "If they come while you travel with Tarek, capture means death for him, prison or hanging for you." Margaret absorbed the implications quickly. An escape attempt now carried even greater risk than she had anticipated. If intercepted by the army patrol, she would be in the company of an Apache warrior, a circumstance that would be nearly impossible to explain favorably, especially given her disappearance from Whispering Springs. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "You could have let me go. Let me face the consequences of my choice." Something flickered in Nakohe's expression, a complex emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Choice made without full knowing is not true choice," he said. "You should understand danger before deciding path." The consideration behind this act, informing her of crucial information that might alter her decision, struck Margaret deeply. Even now, with their interaction potentially drawing to a close, Nakohe was ensuring she had all available facts before committing to her course. "So my options are now what?" she asked. "Stay here as your unwilling wife, or risk death trying to escape through an army patrol?" "There is third path," Nakohe said carefully. "One I have been considering through night hours." Margaret waited, hope and wariness warring within her. "Marriage between us need not be as counsel envisions," he continued, choosing each word with evident precision. "Among Apache, different forms of union exist, some temporary, lasting only until certain conditions met, others binding but with accommodations for unusual circumstances." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked, struggling to understand. "Marriage in name only," Nakohe explained, "protects you with status of chief's wife, satisfies council's demand, but includes private agreement between us." He hesitated, then added, "When safe passage becomes possible, when army focus moves elsewhere or peace talks resume, you would be free to leave if you still wish it." The proposal hung between them in the pre-dawn air, an unexpected compromise that might satisfy the immediate demands of both duty and freedom. "Your council would never agree to such terms," Margaret said, though she couldn't keep a note of hope from her voice. "Council need not know private agreement," Nakohe replied. "They see marriage ceremony assume normal union. What passes between husband and wife remains private matter." Margaret studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. "Why? Would you offer this? You'd be lying to your own people." "Not lying," Nakohe corrected. "Protecting woman who saved my life while also meeting council's need for security. Finding middle path where none seemed to exist." The eastern sky had lightened considerably during their conversation. Soon the camp would be fully awake, and Margaret's window for escape, had she still chosen that route, would close. She needed to decide, and quickly. What would such a marriage entail, she asked, her practical nature asserting itself. "What would be expected of me? You would live in my dwelling," Nakohe explained. "Share meal fires, participate in women's activities, learn Apache ways. To outside eyes, normal wife of chief." His gaze remained steady, "but private understanding between us would establish boundaries. Your person would remain your own." The delicate phrasing made his meaning clear. This would be a marriage, in appearance only, with no physical expectations. The realization brought both relief and a complex emotion Margaret wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "And if I wanted to leave eventually?" she pressed. "How would that be explained to your people? When time comes, would say you return to check on your property," Nakohe replied. "Natural desire White Council would understand. Once away, if you choose not to return." He spread his hands in a gesture of acceptance. "Life brings many unexpected turns. Apache understand this better than most." As the first ray of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, illuminating Nakohe's face in golden light, Margaret weighed the proposal against her limited alternatives. Escape now carried deadly risk, not just for herself, but for Tarak, who had agreed to guide her solely out of loyalty to his chief. Remaining as Nakohe's wife under council's terms meant surrendering her autonomy indefinitely. This third path, this compromise, offered a measure of safety while preserving the possibility of future freedom. It required trust on both sides. Her trust that Nakohe would honor their private agreement, and his trust that she wouldn't betray the Apache's location to the army if she eventually left. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" she asked, the question essential despite the offense it might cause. Nakohe showed no sign of anger at the implied doubt. "Same way I know you will keep yours, by judging heart through actions already shown." He touched his healing shoulder briefly. "You could have left me to die, chose differently. I measure you by that choice, not by fears about what might come." The simple dignity of his response settled something within Margaret. Through all the chaos and fear of recent days, Nakohe had demonstrated a consistent honor and consideration that transcended the cultural boundaries between them. "If we do this," she said slowly, "I would need to maintain some connection to my own identity. My name, my language, my memories of life before." "This is understood," Nakohe nodded. "Apache know value of remembering one's beginnings, even when path leads elsewhere." The camp was coming fully awake now, smoke rising from numerous cooking fires, children emerging from wiki-ups, women beginning their daily tasks. Soon Margaret's absence from Nijoni's lodge would be noticed. "I need to give Tarak a message," she said, having made her decision. "He's waiting for me, expecting to guide my escape." "Already done," Nakohe replied. "Sent Hunter at first light to tell him plans changed. He returns to camp by different path, as if from early hunting." The thoroughness of his preparation impressed Margaret. "You seem to have anticipated my choice." Shadow of a smile touched Nakohe's lips, anticipated both possible choices. Also arranged for horses to be ready if you had decided to leave. The smile faded. Wanted true choice for you, whatever direction it led. The consideration behind such arrangements, ensuring her safety regardless of her decision, told Margaret more about the man before her than any words could have. Whatever his people's customs, whatever cultural differences separated them, Nakohe himself possessed a fundamental decency that transcended such boundaries. "Then I accept your proposal," she said firmly. "A marriage with private understanding. Between us, maintaining appearances for your counsel while preserving my eventual freedom of choice." Relief flickered briefly across Nakohe's features before his customary reserve reasserted itself. "We should return to camp separately," he advised, glancing toward the increasingly active settlement. "You to Nizoni's lodge, as if you considered options through night and made decision with morning light. I will speak to Kitchemesi, tell him you have chosen to accept council's judgment." As Margaret turned to go, Nakohe caught her sleeve lightly. "There is one more thing," he said, his expression serious. "Marriage ceremony happens today. Includes ritual where medicine woman asks spirits if union is approved." His dark eyes held hers intently. "Nizoni has gift for seeing beyond surface thoughts. If your decision is not truly made, she may perceive divided heart." The warning was clear. Half measures would not suffice. For this deception to succeed, Margaret needed to commit fully to her decision, at least for now. "My heart isn't divided," she assured him. "I've chosen this path with open eyes, knowing what it means." Nakohe nodded, satisfied. "Then go with Sun's blessing, Nada. Next time we speak will be before council as man and woman who joined two worlds in one circle." As Margaret made her way back to Nizoni's lodge, the rising sun warming her shoulders, she reflected on the bizarre truth of her situation. She had come west seeking independence, determined to make her own way without relying on any man. Now she walked deliberately toward marriage to an Apache chief, a union that represented both her greatest compromise and, paradoxically, her best hope for eventual freedom. Life's strange windings indeed. She could almost hear Thomas's incredulous laughter at how thoroughly his practical, independent sister had been swept into extraordinary circumstances. Yet somehow, despite everything, Margaret Collins found herself moving forward with a clarity of purpose that had eluded her throughout the long night of indecision. For better or worse, she had made her choice. Now she would live with its consequences, one day at a time. When Margaret returned to Nizoni's lodge, she found the medicine woman awake and calmly preparing a morning meal, showing no surprise at her guest's early morning absence or subsequent return. The old woman merely glanced up, her obsidian eyes sweeping over Margaret with that peculiar penetrating quality that seemed to see beneath surfaces. "You have walked the night paths and returned," Nizoni observed, stirring a pot of what appeared to be a corn porridge. "What did spirits show you in darkness?" The question felt loaded with meaning beyond its simple wording. Margaret chose her response carefully, mindful of Nakohe's warning about the medicine woman's perceptiveness. "That sometimes the wisest path isn't the one that seems most obvious," she replied. "I've decided to accept the council's judgment." Nizoni nodded slowly, her weathered face revealing nothing. "Good. Fighting rivers flow wastes strength needed for swimming." She gestured toward the steaming pot. "Eat. Marriage ceremonies require endurance." Margaret accepted the simple wooden bowl, grateful for the nourishment despite her churning emotions. As she ate, Nizoni moved about the lodge, gathering various items from her storage pouches and laying them out in what appeared to be a specific arrangement. A pottery bowl containing water, several small bundles of herbs, pigments in earthy, red and white, and a beautifully crafted knife with a bone handle. What should I expect? Margaret asked, watching these preparations with growing curiosity and apprehension. Apache marriage joins not just man and woman, but families, clans, spirits, Nijoni explained, working as she spoke. Chief's marriage carries special power, requires stronger medicine. She glanced up, measuring Margaret with those knowing eyes. Ceremony asks spirits to bless union, asks ancestors to witness, asks earth and sky to hold marriage in balance. And if the spirits disapprove, Margaret couldn't help asking. Nijoni's mouth curved slightly. Spirits rarely speak directly. More often they work through those who listen. She tapped her chest. Medicine woman listens. If union carries bad, medicine, Nijoni would know. The implication was clear, confirming what Nakohe had warned. This ceremony would involve some form of spiritual assessment by Nijoni herself. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. Could she truly convince this perceptive old woman that she embraced this marriage willingly? You fear judgment, Nijoni observed, reading her expression. No need. Spirits judge truth of heart, not perfection, of feeling. She returned to her preparations, adding, many marriages begin with fear thoughts, even those chosen freely. Before Margaret could respond, the lodge flap opened and Tala entered, her young face bright with excitement. Council sends me, she announced. Time to prepare bride for ceremony. What followed was an elaborate ritual of preparation unlike anything in Margaret's experience. Under Nijoni's direction, Tala helped her bathe in water infused with aromatic herbs, then dressed her in a new garment, a soft buckskin dress more elaborately decorated than the one she had been wearing, with intricate beadwork along the yoke and fringe that moved like water with each step. Her hair was brushed until it shone like burnished copper in the morning light, then braided in a complex pattern with strands of silver beads woven through. Nijoni herself applied ceremonial markings to Margaret's face, a line of ochre red across her cheekbones, small dots of white clay along her forehead that the medicine woman said represented stars guiding the marriage path. Throughout the process, women from the camp came to offer gifts and advice, speaking through Tala or Nijoni when they knew no English. Some brought practical items. A finely woven basket, a bone awl for leatherwork, a small medicine pouch filled with herbs for common ailments. Others offered wisdom about married life, much of it surprisingly similar to what Margaret imagined. Mothers and aunts might share with brides in white society, counsel about patience, about the value of listening before speaking, about finding balance between independence and partnership. The universality of such advice across cultural boundaries struck Margaret forcefully. These women, whom she had initially perceived as utterly foreign, shared the same fundamental concerns and experiences that shaped women's lives everywhere. Love, family, the negotiation of domestic harmony, the wisdom of choosing one's battles carefully. As the sun climbed toward midday, the preparations neared completion. Nijoni dismissed the other women and approached Margaret with a small leather pouch. Last medicine before ceremony, she explained, opening the pouch to reveal a powder with a resinous scent. Sacred herb that opens path between worlds. Helps her bride and groom see each other's true spirit during binding words. Margaret eyed the substance warily. What does it do, exactly? Opens inner eye, Nijoni replied. Not like white man's whiskey that clouds mind. This clears vision, helps see truth beneath appearances. She sprinkled a small amount of the powder into a cup of water, stirring it with her finger. Not required, but traditional for Chief's marriage. Hesitantly, Margaret accepted the cup. The prospect of consuming an unknown substance that allegedly opened inner eyes during a ceremony where her sincerity would be judged was daunting. Yet refusing might cast doubt on her commitment to accepting Apache ways. Nakohe takes same medicine, Nijoni added, as if sensing her reluctance. Creates bridge between your spirit and his. important for marriage that begins between different peoples, with a silent prayer that the medicine woman wasn't simply drugging her into compliance. Margaret drank the mixture. It tasted bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of pine and some earthy undertone she couldn't identify. Whatever its effects might be, they weren't immediately apparent. "Now we go," Nijoni announced, gathering her ceremonial items. "Council waits at Sacred Circle." The Sacred Circle proved to be a flat area at the highest point of the encampment, where stone pillars arranged in a circular pattern framed a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains. The entire Apache band had gathered, forming a human circle outside the stone one. At the center burned a small fire, its smoke rising straight upward in the still air. Kitchomasi stood to one side of the fire, adorned with symbols of his authority. As war chief, eagle feathers, a necklace of bear claws, red and black paint, accentuating the stern planes of his face. Opposite him stood Nahkohe, similarly decorated, but with the addition of a magnificent headdress that Margaret had not seen before, clearly a marker of his status as band chief. When she entered the circle, a murmur ran through the assembled. Apache, whether it was approval, surprise at her transformed appearance, or simple recognition of the ceremony's commencement, Margaret couldn't tell. She kept her focus on Nahkohe, whose dark eyes reflected a complex mix of emotions as he took. In her ceremonial attire, Nijoni led her to stand before the fire, facing Nahkohe across the flames. The medicine woman began to speak in Apache, her voice taking on a rhythmic, incantatory quality that seemed to resonate with the landscape itself. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, their ritualistic power transcended language. Invocations to forces older than human memory, weaving an invisible pattern that connected those present to something vast and enduring. As the ceremony progressed, Margaret became aware of subtle changes in her perception. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct. The faces of those watching took on an almost luminous quality, their expressions revealing depths of emotion that would normally remain hidden. Was this the effect of Nijoni's medicine, or simply the heightened awareness that accompanied significant life moments? When the medicine woman switched to English, the transition jolted Margaret back to fuller attention. "Fire witnesses," Nijoni intoned. "Earth holds, sky watches, ancestors listen." She gestured toward Nahkohe. "Speak binding words to woman who saved your life." Nahkohe met Margaret's gaze across the dancing flames, his voice carrying clearly to all assembled. "I, Nahkohe, take you, Margaret Collins, as wife under Creator's sky. My strength becomes your protection, my knowledge becomes your guide, my people become your shelter." He paused, then added words that Margaret suspected were not part of the traditional formula. "Your freedom remains your own, guarded within circle of our joining." A subtle murmur ran through the onlookers at this addition, though whether in approval or confusion, Margaret couldn't determine. Nijoni's expression remained impassive as she turned to Margaret. "Now woman speaks binding words to chief who shares her path." Margaret had not been coached on what to say, but Nahkohe's words provided a template. She drew a deep breath, aware of hundreds of eyes upon her, and spoke from a place of truth that surprised even herself. "I, Margaret Collins, take you, Nahkohe, as husband beneath this open sky. My loyalty becomes your assurance. My skills become your support. My knowledge becomes a bridge between our worlds." She hesitated, then added, "My choice stands firm, made freely where paths cross and futures join." As she spoke the final words, Margaret felt a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath her feet had momentarily shifted, realigning itself to accommodate some new reality. The faces watching her seemed to blur slightly before resolving into sharper focus. Nahkohe's expression across the fire reflected a similar experience, his eyes widening fractionally. Nijoni nodded, satisfaction evident in her weathered features. She produced the bone-handled knife Margaret had noticed during preparations, using it to cut small locks of hair from both bride and groom. These she cast into the fire with a handful of fragrant herbs, causing the flames to momentarily flare. Blue-green as smoke curled upward in elaborate patterns. "Fire takes offering," the medicine woman declared. "Spirits accept binding." She reached for their hands, placing Margaret's palm against Nakohe's across the fire's heat. "What spirits join? Let no person break. What choice has woven? Let no doubt unravel." As their hands touched, Margaret experienced a disorienting flash of something, not a vision exactly, but a moment of connection so profound it transcended ordinary awareness. For the briefest instant, she felt she could sense Nakohe's emotions as clearly as her own, his determination to honor their private agreement, his genuine respect for her courage, and beneath these, a complex weave of responsibility, loneliness, and hope that mirrored her own hidden feelings with uncanny precision. From his startled expression, Margaret suspected he had experienced something similar. A momentary glimpse behind her careful composure to the turbulent emotions beneath. Their eyes locked in mutual recognition of this unexpected intimacy, a shared secret beyond even their spoken agreement. Nijoni released their hands, stepping back with a knowing look that suggested she had witnessed the exchange on some level beyond physical sight. "It is done," she announced, raising her voice to address the entire gathering. "Chief and Lifebringer are joined as one circle, two streams meeting in stronger river." A shout went up from the assembled Apache, a sound of celebration and approval that echoed against the surrounding mountains. Drums began to beat, and the formal solemnity of the ceremony gave way to festivity. Children darted forward, scattering cedar seeds and pine nuts in their path as symbols of fertility and abundance. Women approached with congratulatory embraces for Margaret, while warriors clasped forearms with Nakohe in gestures of respect. As they moved through the crowd together, now officially husband and wife in the eyes of the Apache people, Nakohe leaned close to Margaret, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Private agreement stands firm," he assured her, clearly concerned she might fear their unexpected moment of connection had altered their arrangement. "Whatever medicine showed between us changes nothing of our understanding." "I know," Margaret replied, surprised to find she truly did trust his word, despite the bizarre circumstances that had brought them to this moment. "Though I believe we both saw more than expected." A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Nijoni's medicine is powerful, shows truth beneath surface thoughts." He glanced at the medicine woman who was now directing preparations for the marriage feast. "She knows, I think, about our arrangement." "Does that concern you?" Margaret asked, suddenly worried. "No," he replied thoughtfully. "If she saw truth and still blessed union, means our path has purpose beyond what either of us planned." His dark eyes met hers with unexpected warmth. "Perhaps wisdom in finding middle way where neither expected one to exist." As they took their places at the center of the celebration, honored as chief and new wife, Margaret found herself in the strangest position of her life, married to an Apache chief under a private agreement that preserved her eventual freedom, participating in traditions utterly foreign to her upbringing, and experiencing a connection to her husband that defied simple explanation. Yet beneath the strangeness, beneath the cultural chasm that still separated them, she sensed a foundation of mutual respect that seemed more substantial than many marriages founded on more conventional grounds. Whether this unexpected union would prove temporary arrangement or something more meaningful remained to be seen. For now, she had navigated the ceremony with sincerity enough to satisfy even Nijoni's perceptive gaze. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret realized with faint surprise that she felt something unexpected amid the tumult of recent days. A cautious sense of peace, as if the decision she had made, however unconventional, had been the right one after all. 6 months had passed since the marriage ceremony that bound Margaret Collins to Nakohe, chief of the Sokonende Apache. Winter had descended upon the mountains and then reluctantly retreated, giving way to spring's tentative green shoots and warming breezes. During those months, what had begun as a strategic alliance, a marriage of convenience to protect both, Margaret's life and the Apache band's security, had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. Margaret stood at the edge of the encampment, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in hues of gold and amber. She wore Apache clothing with the ease of familiarity now, her movements no longer constrained by the impractical layers of frontier women's attire. Her hair hung in a single braid down her back, interwoven with strands of blue beads that marked her as the chief's wife. "Your thoughts travel far this morning," Njoni observed, approaching with the silent step that still occasionally startled Margaret, despite months of living among the Apache. "To Whispering Springs," Margaret admitted. The medicine woman was one of the few people with whom she could speak freely about her former home. The spring wildflowers would be blooming now along the creek bed. Njoni nodded, her weathered face thoughtful. "You miss your place." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Sometimes, though not as much as I expected to." She gestured toward the busy encampment, where women prepared morning meals, children played, and warriors readied for hunting parties. "I've found unexpected purpose here." This was true in ways that still surprised her. What had begun as a performance, going through the motions of being Nakohe's wife while privately maintaining her independence, had gradually transformed into genuine integration with the Apache community. She had learned their language with determined effort, mastered traditional skills from hide tanning to basket weaving, and even begun assisting Njoni with basic healing practices, combining her frontier medical knowledge with Apache herbal traditions. Most unexpected had been the evolution of her relationship with Nakohe himself. Their private agreement had remained intact. He had never pressured her for anything beyond the public appearance of marriage. Yet over the months, respect had deepened into friendship, and friendship into something more complex that neither of them had fully acknowledged. They shared Nakohe's dwelling as husband and wife, though separate sleeping areas maintained the boundaries of their arrangement. They ate meals together, discussed band matters, and gradually developed the easy communication of two people who had come to know each other's minds well. Many evenings were spent in conversation that ranged from philosophical discussions about their different cultures to practical matters of survival in the harsh mountain environment. "Council gathers today," Njoni reminded her, drawing Margaret back to the present. "Big decision comes." The big decision had been brewing for several weeks. Army representatives had made contact through the Navajo trader Hosteen, proposing peace talks between Colonel Adams' forces and the Sokonende Apache. The terms included safe passage for Nakohe and selected tribal representatives to the Army's newly established outpost at Silver Creek, the first significant opportunity for diplomatic engagement since the ambush that had nearly killed Nakohe. Almost 7 months earlier, the council was deeply divided. Some, led by Kichomesi, argued vehemently against trusting army promises again. Others, particularly the elder women whose influence often swayed band decisions, advocated for exploring the possibility of a genuine peace. Nakohe had been carefully neutral in public discussions, gathering opinions from all factions before the final council vote scheduled for that day. "Do you think they'll agree to the talks?" Margaret asked Njoni, knowing the medicine woman's views carried substantial weight among the elders. "Path has many turnings," Njoni replied with characteristic obliqueness. Then, more directly, "But war path grows weary. Too many graves mark its course." She studied Margaret with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond surfaces. "You will speak at council today. Nakohe has decided." The news startled Margaret. While she had gradually earned a place of respect within the community, she had never been invited to address the council directly on matters of such importance. "Are you certain? Many warriors still see me as outsider." "You stand between worlds," Najoni said simply. "See with two visions where others see with one. Chief believes your words hold medicine for difficult choice." Before Margaret could respond, a commotion at the camp's perimeter drew their attention. A rider approached at speed, one of the scouts who maintained vigilance around the Apache territory. He dismounted in a fluid motion and strode directly toward Nakohe's dwelling, his expression urgent. By mid-morning, the news had spread throughout the camp. A small army patrol had been spotted in the lower valley. 5 soldiers and a civilian guide carrying a white flag of truce. They had made no attempt to approach the hidden camp directly, but had established a temporary position near the valley entrance, obviously waiting to be contacted. The council gathered earlier than planned, the atmosphere charged with tension and speculation. Margaret sat beside Najoni in the circle of elders, acutely aware of the scrutiny her presence attracted. Nakohe occupied his place as chief, his face impassive despite the significance of the moment. Kitchamasi spoke first, his warrior's instinct immediately suspicious. "White flag means nothing," he declared in Apache, with Margaret now fluent, enough to understand without translation. "Could be trap, like before." Others voiced similar concerns, the memory of the previous year's ambush still raw. But one of the elder women, a grandmother whose 2 sons had died in skirmishes with soldiers, raised her hand for attention. "If we refuse all paths to peace, we choose only path to grave," she said, her aged voice nevertheless carrying authority. "Our children need future beyond hiding and fighting." The debate continued, passionate but disciplined. Different perspectives were offered, historical grievances weighed against practical necessities. Throughout, Nakohe listened more than he spoke, his dark eyes occasionally meeting Margaret's across the council circle. Finally, he raised his hand, silencing the discussion. "We have new voice among us," he said, gesturing toward Margaret, "one who knows both Apache ways and white man's thoughts. Let us hear what Chief's wife would say about these peace talks." All eyes turned to Margaret. The moment crystallized. The extraordinary journey of the past 6 months, from captive to Chief's wife, from outsider to trusted voice. She rose to her feet, drawing on both the confidence she had developed at Whispering Springs and the wisdom she had absorbed among the Apache. "I have lived in 2 worlds," she began, speaking in Apache out of respect for the elders who knew little English. "I have seen cruelty and honor in both. The soldiers who come with white flag may indeed bring deception, but they may also bring opportunity." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Colonel Adams is a hard man, but he answers to others who grow tired of endless conflict. The territory is changing. More settlers arrive each season. The old ways of fighting cannot continue forever." Murmurs ran through the council, some of agreement, others of dissent. Margaret continued, choosing her words carefully. "I believe the invitation should be accepted, but with caution. Not Nakohe himself at first, but trusted warriors who can assess the soldiers' true intentions. If they prove honorable, then perhaps a path opens that serves both peoples." She sat down, having said her piece. The council erupted in discussion, with Kitchamasi predictably opposing her suggestion, while others found merit in its pragmatism. Throughout the debate, Nakohe remained thoughtful, his expression revealing nothing of his own leanings. As the sun reached its zenith, he finally stood, signaling his readiness to decide. The council fell silent, awaiting the chief's judgment. "The words of my wife hold wisdom," he declared. "We will send 3 warriors, Tarek, Swift Knife, and Shadow Walker, to meet the soldiers' party. They will carry my authority to here, What is offered but not to make final agreements? He turned to Kitchemasi. You will oversee their preparation and choose the meeting place, somewhere defensible, with clear escape routes if needed. It was a compromise that acknowledged both the opportunity presented and the very real dangers involved. The council received the decision with general approval, though Kitchemasi's expression remained skeptical as the gathering dispersed to prepare for the diplomatic mission. Nakohe approached Margaret. "Walk with me," he said quietly. They moved away from the camp toward a small mesa that offered privacy and a commanding view of the surrounding territory. "Your words swayed many minds today," he observed when they were alone. "Even Kitchemasi, though he would never admit it." "I only spoke what seemed true," Margaret replied. "This conflict can't continue indefinitely. There must be accommodation on both sides." Nakohe studied her face, his expression unusually open. 6 moons ago you stood before council as unwilling captive. Today you help shape future of Tsokanende. People?" A hint of wonder colored his voice. "Path turns in unexpected ways." The observation hung between them, laden with unspoken acknowledgement of how their relationship had evolved. Their marriage of convenience had become something neither had anticipated, a partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection that transcended their original arrangement. "If these peace talks succeed," Margaret said carefully, "it might eventually be safe for me to visit Whispering Springs, to see what's become of my property." It was the first time in months she had directly referenced their private agreement about her eventual freedom to leave. Nakohe's expression stilled, something flickering in his dark eyes that might have been pain quickly masked. "Yes," he agreed, his voice neutral. "Safe passage would be part of any meaningful peace treaty." He turned slightly, gazing out across the valley. "Is that what you wish? To return to your former life?" The question demanded honesty, both with Nakohe and with herself. 6 months ago, her answer would have been immediate and unequivocal. Now, it required deeper consideration. "I want to see Whispering Springs again," she said finally. "It was my home, and I left it without closure." But she hesitated, then continued with the directness that had always characterized their most significant conversations. "I'm no longer certain it's where I belong." Nakohe turned to face her fully, searching her expression for the truth behind her words. "And where do you belong, Margaret Collins? Between worlds, in neither, or perhaps in both," she finished for him. "With someone who also understands what it means to walk between different paths without abandoning either." Something shifted in Nakohe's face, a guardedness giving way to cautious hope. "Our agreement has always honored your freedom to choose," he said carefully. "That remains unchanged, but if your choice led to staying—" He paused, then continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "It would bring joy to more hearts than just mine." The admission, the closest he had come to declaring personal feelings beyond their pragmatic arrangement, touched Margaret deeply. In that moment, the full arc of their improbable journey seemed to crystallize, from wounded warrior and reluctant rescuer to coerced marriage partners, to something neither had imagined possible: 2 people from utterly different worlds discovering common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. "I can't promise forever," Margaret said honestly, "but I can promise now, and tomorrow, and days beyond that, for as long as the path seems right." It wasn't a declaration of conventional love, but it was truth, the foundation upon which their unusual relationship had always been built. Nakohe understood this, nodding with an acceptance that asked for nothing more than what she freely offered. "Among Apache," he said quietly, "marriage truly begins not with ceremony, but with moment when 2 spirits recognize each other beyond all differences. Perhaps ours begins today." As they stood together on the mesa, the vast Arizona landscape Spreading before them, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. A wounded warrior at her spring, a forced departure from her ranch, a marriage intended as temporary solution to an impossible situation, and now the possibility of a future neither of them could have envisioned, one that encompassed both worlds rather than requiring the abandonment of either. 3 days later, Tarek and the other emissaries returned from their meeting with the army representatives. The soldiers had indeed brought a genuine offer of peace negotiations, not perfect, but a starting point from which real progress might emerge. Colonel Adams, facing pressure from territorial officials to reduce conflicts that deterred settlement, had authorized preliminary discussions that could lead to formal treaty talks. With the council's approval, Nakohe prepared to meet personally with the army representatives, this time at Hostine's trading post on neutral ground. Margaret would accompany him, her presence serving both as symbol of cross-cultural possibility and practical interpreter when nuances of language threatened understanding. On the morning of their departure, Margaret stood once more at the edge of the Apache camp, watching the sunrise illuminate the eastern mountains. Nijoni joined her, carrying a small pouch of medicine herbs for the journey. "Full circle comes," the old woman observed cryptically. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. Nijoni's weathered face creased in a rare smile. Woman saved Chief's life, now perhaps help save his people through peace path. She handed Margaret the medicine pouch. "Some circles meant to be, even when we fight against them at first." As Nakohe joined them, mounted on his favorite war horse with Margaret's paint mare ready beside him, she reflected on Nijoni's words. Perhaps the medicine woman was right. Perhaps some circles were indeed meant to be, not as coercion or fate, but as opportunity for those willing to see beyond conventional boundaries. "Ready for new path?" Nakohe asked, extending his hand to help her mount. Margaret took his hand, the gesture now familiar and comfortable, where once it would have seemed impossible. "Ready," she confirmed, settling into her saddle, "for whatever lies ahead." Together they rode from the Apache stronghold toward an uncertain future, not as captive and captor, not as unwilling partners in a forced arrangement, but as two people who had discovered in each other the rare gift of understanding across worlds. Whatever came of the peace talks, whatever decisions lay ahead about where they would ultimately make their home, one truth had emerged from the tumult of their unlikely joining. Some bridges, once built, transformed both shores they connected. Behind them, Nijoni raised her hand in blessing, her ancient eyes seeing far beyond the present moment to possibilities still unfolding on the horizon. "Good medicine," she murmured to herself as the riders disappeared into the morning light. "Very good medicine indeed." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.